In 1989, a photo was found in a parking lot. It showed a girl and a boy, mouths taped, hands tied. The asphalt was hot that August afternoon, shimmering under the Florida sun. Linda shielded her eyes, searching for her car in the sprawling lot of the Winn-Dixie. She'd just finished her shift at the nearby pharmacy, her feet aching. That's when she saw it, tucked beside the wheel of a dusty pickup truck. A small square piece of cardboard. Probably just litter, she thought. But something about its position, almost deliberately placed, made her pause. She bent, her knees cracking softly, and picked it up. It was a Polaroid photograph. The colors were a little washed out, tinged with yellow at the edges, the way old pictures get. But the image itself, the image was sharp. Too sharp. Linda's breath hitched. In the frame, a young woman, maybe late teens or early 20s, with dark hair falling around her shoulders. Beside her, a boy, younger, perhaps early teens, his hair shorter, eyes wide. They were in some kind of vehicle, it looked like. The interior was dark, upholstery worn. But it wasn't the setting that made Linda's stomach clench. It was their faces, or rather, what was on their faces. Silver duct tape, stretched tight across both their mouths, silencing any scream, any plea. Their eyes, though, their eyes were terrifyingly eloquent. Wide, dark, reflecting a pinpoint of light that must have been the camera flash. They stared directly forward, as if looking right at the person who had captured them in this state. Linda felt a chill crawl up her arms despite the baking heat. She looked closer, her hand trembling slightly. Their hands. They were in their laps, but even in the dim light of the photo, she could see ropes. Thin, pale ropes, cinched tight around their wrists, tied behind their backs. The girl's head was tilted slightly. A strand of hair stuck to the tape near her cheek. The boy, he looked so young, so scared. Who were these people? What nightmare had they been trapped in? Linda's mind raced. Was this a prank? A sick joke? But the fear in those eyes, it felt too real. The way the tape pulled at their skin, the tension in their shoulders. No, this wasn't a joke. This was something awful. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked around the parking lot. Cars came and went. People pushed shopping carts, laughing, oblivious. It felt like she had stepped into a different reality, holding this terrible little square in her hand. Where had it come from? Had it fallen out of a car? Been dropped by someone? Or had it been left here to be found? That thought sent a fresh wave of unease through her. She shouldn't have touched it. Fingerprints. Evidence. But it was too late now. She clutched the photo, the glossy surface suddenly feeling slick in her sweating palm. What was she supposed to do with this? Throw it away? Pretend she'd never seen it? The image was already burned into her mind. The girl's haunted gaze, the boy's frozen terror. She couldn't just ignore it. She thought of her own daughter, safe at home. What if this were her? The very idea made her feel sick. Linda walked, almost in a daze, to her car. She unlocked the door, the metal hot to the touch, and slid inside. The air in the car was stifling. She laid the photo on the passenger seat, face up. She couldn't stop looking at it. The raw fear in their eyes was a silent scream that echoed in the quiet of her car. She had to do something. She had to take it to the police. But what would they say? Would they believe it was real? Or dismiss it as some forgotten, twisted piece of art? The questions swirled, making her head ache. There was no date on the Polaroid, no names, no location beyond the dim, confined space of what looked like a van. Just two faces, trapped in a moment of pure horror. A moment that might have been their last. The thought hung heavy in the air. This picture felt old, yet the horror it contained was immediate, suffocating. Who took this picture, and why? Were these children? Were they still alive somewhere? Or was this a ghost from a crime long past? Linda started the engine, her mind made up. She had to find out. She drove away from the supermarket, the photo sitting beside her, a chilling passenger on the ride to the police station. The story it held was just beginning to stir from its 5-year silence. The police station was cool, almost cold. After the oppressive heat outside, Linda stood at the counter, the Polaroid held tight in a tissue she'd found in her purse. Her voice was unsteady when she asked to speak to a detective. A uniformed officer, young, with a bored expression, pointed her to a hard plastic chair. "Someone will be with you," he said, then turned back to his paperwork. The minutes stretched. Linda kept glancing at the tissue in her lap. Was she doing the right thing? What if it was nothing? What if she was making a fool of herself? But then she'd see those eyes again in her mind, wide and pleading. Finally, a man in a rumpled suit approached her. Detective Miller, his name tag read. He looked tired, lines etched around his eyes. He led her to a small, cluttered office. "What can I do for you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice low, a little gravelly. Linda took a deep breath. Carefully, she unfolded the tissue and laid the Polaroid on his desk. "I found this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "In the parking lot, at the Winn-Dixie on Route 7. Miller picked it up. He held it by the edges, his expression unreadable at first. He squinted at it. Then she saw a flicker in his eyes, a shift. He leaned closer. The silence in the small office became heavy. Linda watched him, her own anxiety a tight knot in her chest. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stared at the photograph. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked, his voice now sharper, more focused. Linda described the spot, near the pickup truck, by the cart return. He nodded slowly. "Did you see anyone around? Anyone acting suspicious?" She shook her head. "No, nothing. Just the picture." He kept looking at it, turning it slightly in the light. "Do you have any idea who these people might be?" Linda shook her head again, feeling helpless. "No, I've never seen them before. They look so scared." Miller placed the photo back on the desk very gently. "They do," he agreed, his gaze still on the two faces. "They really do." He looked up at Linda. "Thank you for bringing this in, ma'am. You did the right thing." He asked her more questions. When she found it, if she touched anything else, if she noticed any other discarded items nearby. She answered as best she could. He took her name and number. He told her they would look into it, but Linda could see something in his eyes now, a deep concern that mirrored her own. This wasn't just a strange photo anymore, it was something more. Something that made a veteran detective go quiet and still. As she left the station, back out into the bright sunlight, the world felt different, darker. The image of the girl and the boy stayed with her, their silent screams now a heavy weight on her conscience. What had she stumbled upon? Detective Miller sat at his desk long after Linda had gone. The Polaroid lay before him, under the harsh fluorescent light of his office. He'd seen a lot in his 20 years on the force. Ugly things. Sad things. But this photo, this, had a particular chill. The direct gaze of the victims. The calculated nature of the image. Someone had posed them. Someone had wanted this record of their terror. He picked it up again. A girl and a boy. Young. Too young for this. He thought of the missing persons files. Stacks of them, full of hopeful smiles on school pictures and family snapshots. So many faces, so many stories, that had just stopped. Could these two be in those files? He called in a junior detective, a fresh-faced kid named Russo. "Take a look at this," Miller said, sliding the photo across the desk. Russo picked it up. His initial curiosity quickly turned to a frown, then to a look of disturbed shock. What is this, Sarge?" Miller grunted. "Found in a Winn-Dixie parking lot about an hour ago. Polaroid. Looks like it's been around a while, but the image is clear enough." Russo swallowed. "Their mouths, are they?" Miller nodded. "Duct tape. And ropes on their hands, looks like tied behind them. They're in a vehicle. Van, maybe? Or a large car. Upholstery looks like late 70s, early 80s. His mind was already working, sifting through possibilities. A kidnapping? A hostage situation that went undocumented? Or something even worse? "I want you to do something for me, Russo," Miller said, his voice grim. "Start pulling the unsolved missing persons files for the last, say, 10 years. Focus on late teens, early 20s for the girl, early to mid-teens for the boy. Pairs, if any, went missing together. Or individuals who vanished under strange circumstances. Russo nodded, his usual eagerness subdued. And get this to forensics. See if they can pull anything off it. Age of the photo, any prints, even if it's a long shot, anything about the van interior. Maybe they can sharpen the background. Miller looked back at the photo. The girl's dark hair, the boy's wide, frightened eyes. Someone knew them. Someone, somewhere, was missing them. The question was, had they been missing for a few days? Or a few years? The faded quality of the Polaroid suggested time had passed. How much time? And what happened after this picture was taken? That was the part that made his gut tighten. He had a bad feeling about this. A very bad feeling. This photograph wasn't just a picture. It felt like a message from a forgotten nightmare. And it had just landed on his desk. The first step was identification. Who were they? Finding their names would be the key to unlocking the dark story held within that small square frame. The silence of the photo was deafening, but Miller was determined to make it speak. The call came 3 days later. Detective Miller was staring at the photo again, which now sat protected in an evidence bag on his desk. It had become a grim fixture in his office. Forensics hadn't found any usable prints on the photo itself, just smudges from Linda, and now a few of his own. The Polaroid film stock was common, used over a span of years, making it hard to date precisely without more context. They were working on enhancing the background details of the van, but it was slow going. Russo had been diligently sifting through missing persons files, his desk piled high. So far, no immediate matches for a boy and girl disappearing together under such circumstances. Then, his phone rang. It was a detective from a neighboring county, a guy named Peterson he'd known for years. "Frank," Peterson's voice crackled over the line. "You still looking at that Polaroid you called me about? The one with the kids taped up?" Miller sat up straighter. "Yeah, Bill. Got it right here. Why?" There was a pause. Miller could hear Peterson take a slow breath. I think we might know who the girl is." Miller's heart rate quickened. "Go on," Peterson continued, his voice heavy. "We had a case back in 1984. College student, Sarah McCann, disappeared on her way to see her boyfriend. Never seen again. 1984. 5 years ago." That would fit with the faded look of the Polaroid. "Sarah McCann," Miller repeated, writing the name down. "Dark hair? About 1920 back then?" "That's her," Peterson confirmed. "Pretty girl. Smart. Whole life ahead of her. Parents were devastated. Still are. We worked it hard, but nothing. Vanished into thin air." Miller felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Did you show them the photo?" he asked, already dreading the answer. Another pause. "Her mother just saw it. We sent a copy over. She collapsed, Frank. It's her. She's sure of it. Said she'd know her daughter's eyes anywhere." The words hung in the air. Sarah McCann. After 5 years, a single horrifying image was the first sign of what might have happened to her. Miller closed his eyes for a moment. The relief of identification was immediately swamped by the horror of the context. This wasn't just a random disturbing photo. It was a piece of a real family's ongoing nightmare. "What about the boy?" Miller asked. "Was anyone reported missing with her? Or, around the same time, a boy matching that description?" Peterson sighed. "No, that's the strange part. Sarah was alone when she left, headed to her boyfriend's apartment. The boy in that picture, he's a mystery to us. We never had a missing boy linked to her case. So, the photo had solved one mystery only to deepen another. Sarah McCann and an unknown boy. Together, in a dark van, their faces a mask of terror." Miller thanked Peterson, his mind already racing. Now they had a name, a starting point. A ghost from 1984 had just stepped out of the shadows, brought back by a faded Polaroid found in a supermarket parking lot. The task ahead was immense, to find out what happened to Sarah McCann and the boy beside her, and to find the person who had sealed their lips and captured their fear. The photo was no longer just an image. It was Sarah's voice, screaming silently for 5 long years, and Miller knew he had to listen. The case of Sarah McCann, cold for half a decade, was now burning hot. The news hit Sarah McCann's parents like a physical blow. 5 years. 5 years of agonizing uncertainty, of praying for a call, any call, that would tell them their daughter was alive, or at least what had become of her. They had kept her room untouched, a shrine to the bright, vibrant girl who had walked out the door one crisp October afternoon in 1984 and never come back. Her father, John, had aged a decade in those 5 years, his hair now completely white, his shoulders perpetually stooped. Her mother, Mary, had retreated into a quiet world of grief, finding solace only in tending her small garden, a place Sarah had loved, and now this, a photograph. A confirmation of their deepest, darkest fears. Detective Miller and a local officer assigned to help reopen the case visited them the next day. The McCann house was small, neat, filled with a quiet sadness that seemed to seep from the walls. Mary McCann sat on the sofa, clutching a framed picture of Sarah, a graduation photo, Sarah smiling, full of hope. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. John McCann stood by the window, his back to the room, looking out at the unchanging street. He hadn't said much since they'd arrived. Miller spoke gently, explaining what little they knew, which was essentially just the photo and Linda's account of finding it. He didn't press them for details of Sarah's disappearance yet. That would come. For now, this was about acknowledging their pain, their renewed trauma. "It's her," Mary whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at a copy of the Polaroid Miller had brought. She traced the outline of Sarah's face on the glossy paper with a shaking finger. "My Sarah. Oh God, what did they do to her?" Tears streamed down her face, unchecked. John finally turned from the window, his expression ravaged. He walked over and sat beside his wife, taking her hand. His own eyes were filled with a terrible, helpless anger. "Who's the boy?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "We don't know him. Did Sarah know him?" Miller had to tell them the truth. "We don't know yet, Mr. McCann. That's one of the things we're trying to find out. He wasn't reported missing with Sarah." This seemed to deepen their confusion, their despair. Another unknown horror layered onto their existing one. They talked about Sarah, what she was like. A good student, studying to be a teacher, loved books, music, hiking in the nearby state park. She was kind, they said, always helping others. Had no enemies they could think of. She was excited about visiting her boyfriend Michael that day. They were talking about getting engaged soon. Michael. Miller made a note to speak with him again. He'd been interviewed extensively back in 1984, of course. He'd been heartbroken, frantic. His alibi had been solid. He was at his apartment, waiting for Sarah. But 5 years was a long time. Memories faded, or sometimes new details emerged. The afternoon Sarah disappeared was etched in her parents' minds. October 12th, 1984. A Friday. She'd finished her classes at the community college around 3 p.m. She'd called home, a quick, cheerful conversation with her mother. Said she was going straight to Michael's. He lived about a 20-minute drive away. She was driving their old blue Ford Escort. The car was found a week later, abandoned in a mall parking lot, about 10 miles from Michael's apartment, in the opposite direction of her route. Keys in the ignition. Her purse was gone. No signs of a struggle in the car. It was as if she'd just parked it and walked away. But Sarah would never have done that. Not without her purse. Not without telling anyone. The initial search had been frantic. Police, volunteers, friends, family. They'd combed the woods near where the car was found, put up flyers with Sarah's smiling face all over town. Michael had been distraught, almost incoherent with grief and fear. The police had looked at him, of course. Boyfriends always got a hard look, but there was nothing. No motive, no evidence. He'd been as desperate to find her as everyone else. Leads had dried up. Sightings were reported, then fizzled out. The case slowly, inevitably, went cold. Until now. until a faded Polaroid showed up in a supermarket parking lot 50 miles away. Miller asked about the route Sarah would have taken to Michael's. It was mostly main roads, then a few residential streets. Had there been any construction? Any unusual activity reported that day? John McCann shook his head. It was just a normal Friday. Nothing out of the ordinary that we knew of. He paused. Except Sarah never arrived. The pain in his voice was raw, undiminished by the years. Miller knew this was just the beginning. Reopening a 5-year-old wound was brutal, but necessary. The photograph, as horrific as it was, had given them something they hadn't had in years. A lead. A terrible, chilling lead, but a lead nonetheless. As he left the McCann house, the image of Mary clutching Sarah's picture and John's silent, staring grief stayed with him. He had to find answers for them. Not just about Sarah, but about the boy who shared her terrifying predicament in that dark, claustrophobic space. Who was he? And how did his fate become so tragically intertwined with Sarah McCann's? The photo held the key, but the lock was proving to be incredibly complex. The darkness in that van seemed to stretch out, casting a long shadow over the present. The next step was to talk to Michael, Sarah's boyfriend from 1984. His name was Michael Bishop. Finding him wasn't hard. He still lived in the same town, though he'd moved from the apartment he'd shared with roommates back then. He was a manager at a local hardware store now, married, with a young child. When Detective Miller called him, Michael's voice was wary. When Miller mentioned Sarah McCann, there was a sharp intake of breath, then a heavy silence. He agreed to meet, his voice strained. They met at a small coffee shop, neutral territory. Michael Bishop looked older than his 30 years. The boyish charm Sarah's parents had mentioned was gone, replaced by a settled weariness. He seemed nervous, his hands fidgeting with a sugar packet. Miller got straight to the point, sliding a copy of the Polaroid across the table. He watched Michael's face. Recognition dawned slowly, then horror twisted his features. Is that Sarah?" he whispered, his eyes wide, fixed on the image of the girl. He looked pale, almost green. Miller nodded grimly. "We believe so. Her mother identified her." Michael stared at the photo, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Oh my God," he said, shaking his head. "Oh my God. All these years, I always wondered. Hope she'd just run off. Started a new life. Anything but—" His voice trailed off. He looked at the boy in the photo. "Who's the other one? The kid?" "We don't know yet," Miller said. "That's what we're trying to find out. Do you recognize him? Did Sarah know anyone who looked like him?" Michael shook his head, still staring at the photo, at Sarah's taped mouth, her terrified eyes. "No, I don't think so. Not that I can remember." He looked deeply shaken. The past, which he had clearly tried to bury, was rushing back with a vengeance. Miller let him compose himself for a moment. Then he began to ask questions about that day, 5 years ago. Michael's recollection was hazy at first, then sharpened as he focused. He remembered waiting for Sarah. She was supposed to arrive around 4:30. They were going to a movie. When she hadn't shown up by 5, he started to worry. He called her parents. They hadn't heard from her since her call after class. He started calling her friends. No one had seen her. "I drove her route," Michael said, his voice low. "From the college to my place. Looking for her car. Any sign of an accident. Nothing. Then I drove it again. And again. It was dark by then. I was frantic." He described the call to the police, the agonizing wait, the discovery of her car a week later. It didn't make any sense. The keys in it. Her purse gone. Why would she leave her car like that? He looked at Miller, his eyes pleading for an answer Miller didn't have. "Did she seem worried about anything before she disappeared?" Miller asked. "Anyone bothering her? Any strange encounters?" Michael frowned, thinking back. "No, not really. She was happy. We were happy. Talking about the future." He paused. "There was one thing, though. A few weeks before, she mentioned a van. A dark-colored van. She said she'd seen it a couple of times near the college, and once near her house. She thought it might have been following her." Miller leaned forward. A van? Did she describe it? Get a license plate? Michael shook his head. No, she wasn't sure. Said it was just a feeling. She thought she was being paranoid. I told her not to worry, that it was probably nothing. His face crumpled with guilt. I should have listened. I should have taken it more seriously. A dark-colored van. The people in the photo were in a van. This was the first concrete link, however tenuous. Did she say anything else about it? Make, model, any distinguishing features? Miller pressed. Michael struggled to remember. No, just dark, maybe a bit beaten up. She didn't get a good look at the driver. Said it was too far away, or the windows were tinted. It wasn't much, but it was something. A dark van. That matched the claustrophobic interior in the Polaroid. Miller spent another hour with Michael, going over every detail he could recall from that period. No new enemies of Sarah's came to light. No suspicious figures, other than the shadowy van. Michael had been thoroughly investigated at the time, his alibi confirmed by roommates and phone records. There was no reason to suspect him then, and nothing new suggested otherwise now. He was another victim of Sarah's disappearance, his life forever marked by it. As Miller left, Michael was still staring at the copy of the photo, his face a mask of grief and regret. Find them, detective, he said, his voice hoarse. Please, find out who did this to her. And to that boy. Miller nodded. We're trying, Mr. Bishop. We're trying. The van. It kept coming back to the van. The forensics team had been working on enhancing the image from the Polaroid. The interior was generic, typical of many American vans from the late 70s or early 80s. Worn fabric seats, a glimpse of what looked like wood paneling, common in conversion vans of that era. But there was one small detail, almost invisible to the naked eye, that the enhancement brought out. A tiny decal, or maybe a sticker, on the dashboard, partially obscured. It was a circular logo with some kind of bird in flight, too blurry to identify definitively, but it was a potential clue. Miller put out a bulletin to other departments, to DMV records, looking for information on dark-colored vans, possibly with custom interiors, or that specific bird logo, that might have been active in their area or surrounding counties around 1984. It was a long shot, like searching for a single grain of sand on a vast beach, but it was all they had. Days turned into weeks. The investigation was moving, but slowly. The public appeal for information on the boy in the photo had yielded nothing so far. No family had come forward to claim him. He remained an enigma, his presence in that horrific scene unexplained. Who was he? And why was his fate tied to Sarah McCann's? The pressure was immense. The McCann family called regularly, desperate for news. The local media had picked up the story of the found photo, splashing Sarah's face and the blurred image of the boy across newspapers and television screens. Public interest was high, mixed with a morbid curiosity. Theories abounded, from random abduction to something more sinister and targeted. Miller felt the weight of it all. He kept the original Polaroid locked in his desk, but copies were pinned to a board in the incident room, surrounded by notes, maps, and timelines. Sarah's hopeful graduation smile, and then the terrified eyes in the van. The contrast was a constant, grim reminder of what had been stolen. Then, a break, or at least a potential one. A retired mechanic from a town about 30 miles away saw the news report about the van, the mention of a possible bird logo. He called the hotline. He remembered working on a dark blue Dodge Ram van back in '83 or '84. It had custom paneling inside, he recalled. And the owner had put a bunch of stickers on the dashboard. One of them, he thought, was a bald eagle decal, circular. He even remembered the owner vaguely. A quiet guy, kept to himself. Name was Arthur Jenkins. Lived out on a rural route, had a bit of land. The mechanic wasn't sure if Jenkins still lived there, or if he even still had the van. But it was a name, a possible match for the van. Arthur Jenkins. Miller felt a surge of adrenaline. It was thin, based on a fuzzy memory from years ago, but it was the most concrete lead they'd had on the vehicle itself. Let's find out about Mr. Arthur Jenkins, Miller said to Russo. Let's find out everything. The hunt for the van, and the man who might have owned it, was on. This could be it. This could be the thread that unraveled the whole horrifying tapestry. Arthur Jenkins. The name echoed in Detective Miller's mind. They ran it through the system. Arthur Lee Jenkins, born 1942. A few minor offenses in his youth, shoplifting, a DUI in his early 20s. Nothing violent, nothing recent. He owned a property on Old Mill Road, just outside the small town of Oakhaven, about 25 miles from where Sarah McCann had last been seen, and in the general direction of where her car was eventually found, if one took a very circuitous route. Property records showed he still owned it. No record of a dark blue Dodge Ram van currently registered to him, but that didn't mean much. He could have sold it, junked it, or it could be hidden away, unregistered. Miller decided on a cautious approach. He didn't want to spook Jenkins if he was involved. He sent a patrol car for a quiet drive-by of the Old Mill Road property. The report came back. Isolated. House set back from the road, surrounded by overgrown trees and brush. A dilapidated barn or large shed in the back. No sign of a dark blue van. But there was an old pickup truck parked near the house. Lights were on inside. Jenkins appeared to be home. The next step was tricky. They didn't have enough for a search warrant, not based on a retired mechanic's hazy memory and a blurry logo. They needed more. Miller decided to try a knock and talk. He and Russo would go out there, ostensibly on a routine inquiry about an unrelated, minor local issue, maybe a zoning complaint or a supposed illegal dumping nearby. Just to get a look at Jenkins, see his reaction, and hopefully get a glimpse of the property, particularly that barn. It was a gamble. If Jenkins was their man, he might be suspicious. But doing nothing felt worse. The image of Sarah and the boy, their eyes wide with terror, spurred him on. The drive to Old Mill Road was quiet, the paved road eventually giving way to gravel. The Jenkins property was as isolated as described. The house was small, paint peeling, a porch cluttered with odds and ends. The air felt heavy, still. As they pulled into the unkempt driveway, Miller felt a familiar prickle of unease. This was the kind of place where secrets could fester. He saw a curtain twitch in one of the front windows. Someone was watching. They got out of the car. Miller took a deep breath. "Showtime," he muttered to Russo. Arthur Jenkins answered the door after a long pause. He was a man in his late 40s, but looked older. Thinning gray hair, a pale, unremarkable face. His eyes were watery, nervous, and didn't quite meet theirs. He wore a stained t-shirt and old jeans. He looked more pathetic than menacing, but Miller knew appearances could be deceiving. He introduced himself, and Russo gave their cover story about checking on a dumping complaint in the area. Jenkins listened, his expression wary. He denied knowing anything about it, his voice soft, almost a mumble. Miller tried to keep the conversation going, asking about how long he'd lived there, trying to gauge him. Jenkins was guarded, offering little. Miller's gaze kept drifting towards the barn in the back. It looked old, weathered, the doors shut tight. "Mind if we take a quick look around your property line?" Miller asked casually. "Just to see if any trash might have blown over from the supposed dump site." Jenkins hesitated. His eyes flickered towards the barn, then back to Miller. "There's nothing back there," he said, his voice a little too quick. "Just old junk." That hesitation, that flicker of his eyes, it was enough. Miller felt a knot tighten in his gut. "We won't be long," Miller said, already starting to move slowly towards the side of the house, as if to walk around to the back. Russo followed his lead. Jenkins reluctantly stepped out onto the porch, watching them. He didn't try to stop them, not physically, but his anxiety was palpable. As they rounded the corner of the house, the barn came into clearer view. One of the large wooden doors had a small, grimy window set into it. And sitting just outside the barn, partially hidden by a stack of old tires and a rusted harrow, was the back end of something. Something large, something blue. Faded, yes, paint peeling in spots, covered in dust and cobwebs, but unmistakably the rear fender and bumper of a van, a dark blue Dodge Ram van. Miller's heart hammered. He glanced at Russo. Russo had seen it too. His eyes were wide. This was it. The mid-story spike. This was the moment everything could change. Miller tried to keep his voice even. "That your van, Mr. Jenkins?" he asked, nodding towards the partially visible vehicle. Jenkins licked his lips. He looked trapped. "It's old," he mumbled. "Don't run anymore, just storage." Storage for what? Miller thought. He walked closer to the van, Russo at his side. He could see more of it now. It matched the mechanic's description. He peered through the dirty rear window. It was packed full of junk, old boxes, tools, tarps. But the interior paneling, it looked like dark wood. He then looked at the barn. What was inside there? "We're going to need to take a proper look around, Mr. Jenkins," Miller said. His voice firm now. The pretense dropped. "Including inside that van and the barn." Jenkins started to tremble. You can't," he stammered. "You don't have a warrant." Miller looked him straight in the eye. "We can get one, Arthur. And we will. Or you can cooperate. It'll be easier that way." Jenkins stared at him, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Then Jenkins' shoulders slumped. A look of utter defeat washed over his face. He nodded slowly, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. The barn," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's unlocked." Miller knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were about to step into the heart of Sarah McCann's nightmare. The discovery of the van was huge, but the barn held the real secrets. And the air around it suddenly felt 100 degrees colder. What horrors awaited them inside that dilapidated structure? The doors of the barn creaked loudly as Miller and Russo pulled them open. The smell hit them first. Damp earth, decay, stale air, and something else. Something acrid and metallic, like old fear. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing through cracks in the wooden walls. The interior was vast, much larger than it appeared from the outside, and cluttered with the detritus of years. Old farm equipment, stacks of moldy newspapers, broken furniture, and in the center of the barn, cleared of debris, was a space that made the hairs on Miller's arms stand on end. There were marks on the dirt floor, scuff marks, drag marks, and a dark, ominous stain, large and irregular, that had soaked deep into the earth. Miller's gaze was drawn to a heavy wooden table pushed against one wall. On it, a collection of objects lay scattered, as if left in a hurry. A roll of silvered duct tape, identical to the kind in the Polaroid. Several lengths of rope, similar to what bound the victim's hands, and a Polaroid camera, an old SX-70 model. Miller felt a wave of nausea. This was it. This was the place. Russo, looking pale, pointed to something in the far corner. Half hidden under a pile of dirty tarps was a small, child-sized mattress, stained and ripped. Beside it, a metal bucket. The implications were sickening. This wasn't just a barn. It was a prison, a place of unimaginable suffering. Miller walked slowly around the cleared space, his eyes scanning every detail. He noticed something glinting in the dirt near the large stain. He crouched down. It was a small silver earring, a simple hoop. He carefully picked it up with a gloved hand and placed it in an evidence bag. Could this have belonged to Sarah? Jenkins stood silently by the entrance, head bowed, trembling. He looked like a broken man. Miller approached him. "Arthur," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What happened here? What happened to Sarah McCann and the boy in the picture?" Jenkins didn't look up. He just shook his head, mumbling incoherently. "Talk to us, Arthur," Miller pressed. "It's over. We found the place. We found the camera, the tape, the ropes. Tell us what you did." Jenkins finally raised his head. His eyes were vacant, filled with a distant horror. I didn't mean for it to go so far," he whispered. "It was just the pictures at first. Just the pictures." The casual cruelty of that statement struck Miller like a punch. Over the next few hours, as more officers and the forensics team descended on the property, Jenkins, in halting, often contradictory fragments, began to tell his story. He was a loner, socially awkward, consumed by dark fantasies. He'd seen Sarah McCann near the college. He'd followed her. He admitted to being the one driving the van she'd noticed. On that Friday in October 1984, he'd waited for her on her route to Michael's. He'd staged a minor breakdown with his van, flagging her down for help. When she got out of her car, he'd grabbed her, forced her into his van. He'd driven her car to the mall later, trying to create a false trail. But what about the boy? Miller pressed him on this. Jenkins became agitated. He wasn't part of it, he stammered. He saw me with her. The boy, it turned out, was a local paper boy named Danny Peterson, 12 years old. He'd been on his route, cutting through a wooded shortcut near where Jenkins had initially taken Sarah, a secluded spot where Jenkins had planned to take photos. Danny had stumbled upon them. Jenkins, panicking, had grabbed him too. 2 victims instead of 1. The Polaroid was taken in the back of the van, shortly after he'd abducted Danny, before he brought them both to the barn. He'd wanted a memento of his power, his control. The photo Linda found must have fallen out of his pocket or his truck at some point over the years, a ticking time bomb of evidence. The forensics team was meticulously working through the barn and the van. They found more. Strands of dark hair, matching Sarah's known samples, embedded in the fibers of the old mattress. A child's sneaker, half buried in the dirt, which would later be identified as Danny Peterson's. The dark stain on the floor was indeed blood. And buried in a shallow grave behind the barn, under a pile of rocks and debris, they found human remains. 2 skeletons. 1 clearly adult female, 1 juvenile male. The search for Sarah McCann and the unknown boy was over. The eerie story behind the photo was finally, horrifically, clear. The news of the discovery at Arthur Jenkins' farm sent shockwaves through the community. The McCanns were devastated, yet in their grief, there was a terrible kind of relief. The not knowing, that endless gnawing uncertainty, was finally over. Mary McCann clutched the small silver hoop earring Miller showed her. It was hers, she sobbed. I gave it to her for her 16th birthday. The identification of the boy as Danny Peterson brought another family into the nightmare. Danny had been reported missing a week after Sarah, but his disappearance was initially treated as a possible runaway case. He'd been a quiet boy, sometimes went off on his own. No one had ever connected his vanishing to Sarah McCann's. Now, his parents faced the unimaginable truth of what had happened to their son. 2 families, linked by a shared tragedy, brought together by a faded Polaroid, and the dogged work of an investigation reawakened. Arthur Jenkins was charged with 2 counts of kidnapping and 2 counts of murder. He offered little defense. The evidence was overwhelming. The barn, the van, the photo, his own fragmented confession. The trial was swift. He was found guilty, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, justice of a sort. But it couldn't bring Sarah or Danny back. It couldn't erase the years of pain or the horror of their final days. Linda, the woman who found the photo, attended parts of the trial. She felt a profound sadness, a connection to the victims she'd never known. Her accidental discovery had brought an end to a 5-year mystery, but it had also unearthed an almost unbearable darkness. She often thought of those eyes in the photo, the silent screams she had been the first to hear in so long. Detective Miller closed the McCann-Peterson file with a heavy heart. They had found the truth. They had brought a killer to justice. But the victory felt hollow. The images from the barn, the stark reality of the skeletons, the grief of the families, those things would stay with him. The Polaroid photo, Exhibit A, was now locked away in an evidence vault. A small square of cardboard that had held such a monstrous secret. It was a reminder, he thought, of how fragile life was, how easily darkness could encroach, and how sometimes the smallest, most random discovery could illuminate the deepest shadows. The case was closed, but the echoes of what happened on Old Mill Road would linger for a long, long time. The world felt a little colder, the shadows a little deeper, knowing that such evil could exist, hidden just out of sight, for so many years. The silence of that van, the terror in those eyes. It was a story that would never truly be over for those who were touched by it. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.